The year was 1944. Across a world torn apart by war, the word honor had taken on 1,000 meanings, many buried under the ashes of battlefields. In the Pacific, surrender had never come easy. For the soldiers of Japan, defeat meant disgrace. But for the women who followed them, the journey was far more complex. Now, behind the barbed wire of an American prisoner of war camp, a group of Japanese female POWs stood silently at the edge of a dining hall. Their faces carried the weight of exhaustion and fear, and yet, something far stranger awaited them that evening. They expected punishment, humiliation, perhaps hunger, but instead they saw order. They saw American soldiers lined up neatly, trays in hand, waiting patiently for the women and nurses to step forward first. It was a simple gesture, but to those women, shaped by a culture where rank and gender defined worth, it was almost unthinkable. As they hesitated, unsure whether to move, a U.S. sergeant smiled faintly and said, "Mum, after you." The moment froze in time, a clash of two worlds, two codes of honor. For the first time since their capture, the women were not prisoners, they were guests. And as the scent of warm bread and soup filled the air, one truth began to sink in, that even in war, humanity had its quiet ways of speaking. The dining tent was quiet, yet alive with a kind of order that felt almost sacred. The air carried the faint hum of a generator somewhere beyond the camp walls, blending with the soft clatter of metal trays and distant voices. Outside, the last light of day faded into gold, stretching long shadows across the dust and barbed wire. It was the end of another day in 1944, a day that had begun with fear and uncertainty, but would end with something no one could have imagined. Inside the mess hall, the American soldiers stood in straight lines, their uniforms dusty but neat, their expressions calm, almost solemn. The Japanese female prisoners, some nurses, some clerks, some widows, stood apart, their eyes darting nervously between one another. They had been brought from the infirmary after a long day tending to the wounded. Their clothes were plain, their faces pale and drawn. None of them had eaten properly in days. They expected harsh treatment. They had heard stories before their capture, tales of cruelty, of humiliation, of victors feeding on the suffering of the defeated. And yet, when the guards gestured for them to enter, no weapons were raised, no shouts were heard. Instead, there was a strange stillness, an invitation. One of the women, a former nurse named Aiko, hesitated at the entrance. Her instincts told her to stay back, to wait until the men had eaten first. That was the way things were done. In Japan, women did not eat before men, especially not before soldiers. To do so would have been seen as disrespectful, even shameful. She clutched her thin hands together, uncertain whether to move. But then an American sergeant stepped forward, tall, broad-shouldered, his face young but wary. He gave her a small nod and said something softly, words she didn't understand. Then he gestured toward the tables, and with a polite smile motioned for her to go first. The women exchanged glances. Some thought it must be a mistake. Others assumed it was a trick. But then they noticed the line of soldiers waiting patiently behind them, trays in hand, their eyes turned downward as if in silent respect. The Americans were waiting, not eating, not moving, waiting for the women to be served before them. Aiko's throat tightened. She looked again at the sergeant, who simply said, in halting Japanese, "Ladies first." It was such a small phrase, but in that moment, it might as well have been a thunderclap. Slowly, hesitantly, she stepped forward. The scent of the food hit her first, thick stew simmering with meat and vegetables, something she hadn't smelled in years. A soldier behind the counter, a young man with freckles and tired eyes, smiled and handed her a tray. Steam rose in soft curls from the metal bowl he placed upon it. She could feel the heat against her hands. She murmured a thank you in broken English, though she wasn't sure if he understood. He nodded anyway, and for a brief moment their eyes met, not as enemies, but as two human beings sharing the quiet recognition of survival. As the other women followed, the silence in the tent grew deeper. The Americans stood motionless, watching with quiet respect. No laughter, no boasting, no sound but the steady rhythm of spoons meeting bowls and the occasional whisper of disbelief among the Japanese. The food itself wasn't extravagant. Just stew, a piece of bread, a small portion of fruit, and a cup of weak coffee. But to these women, who had lived through bombings, hunger, and the slow erosion of dignity, it was a feast. And what made it unforgettable wasn't the taste, but the gesture. As Eiko took her first spoonful, her hands trembled. The warmth filled her chest like sunlight breaking through clouds. She hadn't realized how long it had been since she'd tasted something prepared with care. Tears gathered at the edge of her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly, unwilling to show emotion in front of soldiers. At the next table, another woman, Yumi, whispered to her in disbelief. "They let us eat first." Eiko nodded, unable to speak. She looked around. The rows of soldiers still waiting. The soft clinking of utensils as her companions began to eat. The faint light flickering against the canvas walls. It felt almost like another world. A place untouched by war, if only for a moment. When the last woman was served, the sergeant finally gave a quiet nod, and the American soldiers began to move. They lined up with discipline, calm and orderly, taking their portions without rush or noise. Some even smiled faintly at the women as they passed. No one pushed, no one spoke out of turn. For the Japanese women, the concept of captors waiting for their prisoners to eat first was incomprehensible. In their minds, this was the enemy. The same men who had dropped bombs, who had captured their friends, who had broken their empire's pride. And yet here they were, treating them with a respect that defied everything they had been taught to believe. Eiko looked down at her food again. Each bite carried meaning now, not just nourishment but a kind of revelation, the taste of mercy, the taste of equality. She realized, with quiet astonishment, that for the first time since her capture, she felt safe. She remembered her father's words, spoken years before the war. Honor is not in being served first, but in serving others with humility. She had never fully understood that lesson until this moment, when her captors showed her a different kind of honor, one that came not from authority, but from empathy. Across the tent, one of the American cooks glanced at the women with a mixture of curiosity and compassion. He had seen soldiers from many nations pass through the camp, but never had he seen prisoners so cautious, so polite, so visibly shaken by kindness. He whispered to the sergeant beside him, "They don't seem to know what to make of it." The sergeant shrugged lightly. "They'll figure it out." Sometimes respect surprises people more than anger. As the meal went on, the atmosphere softened. A few women began to whisper among themselves, voices low but warm. Some even exchanged faint smiles with their captors. The invisible wall between them, built by war, fear, and propaganda, began to crack just a little. When the meal ended, Eiko rose slowly, unsure if she should clear her tray or leave it. The sergeant noticed and nodded toward a nearby counter, showing her where to place it. She followed his gesture, bowing slightly out of instinct. To her surprise, he returned the gesture, a small bow, awkward but sincere. The gesture struck her deeply. It was as if in that brief moment, both sides acknowledged something unspoken, that humanity could exist even where nations clashed. As they left the tent, the sky had turned to velvet blue. The moon hung low, and the night air was cool and still. Behind them, the Americans continued their meal in silence, and the faint sounds of laughter began to echo softly through the camp. Not mockery, but something gentler. The women walked back to their quarters without speaking. Each one carried her own thoughts, memories. The night air was cool, almost tender, as the women left the mess hall. The scent of stew still clung faintly to their clothes, mingling with the dry, dusty smell of the campgrounds. They walked in silence, their footsteps soft on the dirt path that led back to their quarters. Somewhere in the distance, a guard's lantern flickered, casting brief, wavering shadows along the barbed wire fences. The hum of the generator had quieted, replaced by the rhythmic chirping of crickets, a sound that felt strangely peaceful. Aiko walked at the front of the group, her mind spinning with thoughts she couldn't quite name. She had eaten with the enemy. Not as a prisoner forced to obey, but as a guest invited to share a table. She tried to convince herself it was an act of pity or diplomacy, a strategy meant to weaken their spirit. But the memory of that simple, genuine respect in the sergeant's eyes made that lie impossible to believe. When they reached the row of barracks assigned to them, the women hesitated before entering. The wooden doors creaked as they opened, and a faint warmth escaped from inside. The Americans had allowed them small comforts, cots with thin mattresses, blankets folded neatly, and a small stove that offered a dim, flickering glow. For prisoners, it was far more humane than what they had expected. But tonight, it felt like something more, almost sacred. No one spoke for several minutes. The silence was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that followed revelation, the weight of realizing that something had shifted deep inside them. Finally, one of the younger women, Hana, broke the quiet. Her voice was soft, trembling slightly. "Why did they do that? Why would they let us eat first?" Aiko didn't answer immediately. She sat on the edge of her cot, staring at her hands. "I don't know," she said finally. "Maybe, because that's what they believe in. But we are their prisoners," another woman said from the corner. "They owe us nothing. Why treat us like people?" The word struck Aiko deeply, like people. She understood that feeling too well, the slow erosion of humanity that came with war. To be stripped of dignity was a punishment as cruel as any wound. But tonight, for the first time in months, she had felt something return, not pride, but the quiet awareness of being seen again as human. Outside, the sound of boots on gravel approached. A guard walked by, glancing in through the open doorway. He didn't speak, didn't threaten, didn't gesture for them to sleep. He simply tipped his helmet slightly and moved on. That small, almost invisible act, a nod between captor and captive, carried a kind of peace none of them could explain. Hana sat near the stove, rubbing her arms for warmth. "They said ladies first. That's what he told you, right?" Aiko nodded. "Yes. I think it's their way." "A rule." "Maybe." The others exchanged looks. In their culture, ladies first wasn't a rule. It was unimaginable. Women were expected to endure quietly, to serve with grace, not to be served. Yet here, the enemy practiced a form of honor they had never known. For years, Aiko had been taught that honor was bound to sacrifice, that a person's worth was proven through duty, through obedience to one's country, one's emperor, one's role. But as she sat there, wrapped in a thin blanket, she began to see another kind of honor, one that wasn't about command or submission, but about respect freely given. The next morning the camp came alive with routine. Trumpets sounded at dawn, and the guards made their rounds. The women lined up as usual for roll call, their expressions calm, their bodies tense. But beneath the surface something had changed. They looked at their captors differently now, not with defiance or fear, but with cautious curiosity. The sergeant from the night before stood nearby, clipboard in hand. He nodded at Aiko as he passed. It wasn't a smile, but it wasn't cold either. Just acknowledgement. The simple recognition of her existence. It was enough. Later that day, as they walked to their work area, Aiko noticed the camp flag fluttering in the wind, the stars and stripes rippling against the pale sky. She thought about the American belief in freedom, a concept she had always associated with rebellion and arrogance. But now she saw that their sense of freedom extended even into small gestures, like allowing prisoners to walk with their heads held high. In the afternoon, Aiko was assigned to the infirmary to assist the American nurses. The room smelled of antiseptic and sunlight. The nurses were brisk, efficient, their sleeves rolled up, their movements confident. When Aiko entered, one of them, a tall woman with bright eyes, smiled warmly and handed her a stack of bandages. "Thank you for helping," she said simply. Aiko hesitated. No one had thanked her since before the war. She nodded, her voice caught in her throat. "I will do my best." For hours they worked side by side, cleaning wounds, changing dressings, checking supplies. The American nurse didn't treat her like a prisoner. She treated her like a colleague. When they spoke, it was in short, broken exchanges of English and gestures, but something deeper passed between them. A quiet understanding that suffering had no nationality. That evening, when the women returned to their quarters, the conversation was different. They no longer whispered about fear or punishment. They spoke of customs, of the strange politeness of the Americans, of the way the soldiers greeted them with small nods and calm voices. One woman laughed softly. "If we treated our prisoners like this, our commanders would have our heads." Aiko smiled faintly. Maybe that's why they are not afraid of losing their honor. As night settled once again, the moon bathed the camp in a silvery glow. The fences looked less threatening in the soft light. The guard towers, once symbols of control, now seemed distant, almost protective. The women sat outside their barracks, listening to the quiet sounds of the camp, boots on gravel, the low murmur of men talking, the soft rustle of wind through the nearby trees. Aiko thought about her homeland, the rigid traditions, the strict codes of obedience. She thought of how she had once admired soldiers who never smiled, who believed compassion was weakness. But now, after a single act of kindness, she began to see that strength could look different, quieter, gentler, but no less powerful. It wasn't. The days that followed blurred together in quiet rhythm. Morning roll calls, meals in the mess hall, hours of assigned work, and long evenings of reflection. The war outside the fences still raged, but inside the camp, life had fallen into something that almost resembled peace. The Japanese female prisoners had grown used to the soft hum of American discipline. The way every task had structure, Every hour had purpose. There was no shouting, no punishment for small mistakes, no deliberate cruelty. It was an odd kind of captivity, one that nurtured reflection instead of fear. Echo awoke each morning before dawn. The sound of boots on gravel always came first, followed by the creak of the camp gate opening for the day's first patrol. She would lie there for a moment, staring at the wooden ceiling above her, listening to the faint whistle of wind through the cracks. It reminded her of home, the way the sea breeze once slipped through her window back in Yokohama, before the world had turned to smoke and ash. When she rose, she folded her blanket neatly, adjusted her hair, and joined the line outside her barracks. The air was cold, sharp enough to make her cheeks sting. Yet even that sting felt alive, a reminder that she still existed, still breathed, still belonged somewhere, even if that somewhere was behind barbed wire. Breakfast was simple: oatmeal, coffee, sometimes fruit. But it came with a strange comfort. The Americans served their meals on time, every day, without fail. To them, it was routine. To the Japanese women, it was reliability, something that war had stolen long ago. It was during one such morning that Eiko noticed something small but meaningful. As the guards stood watch over the line, one soldier accidentally dropped his spoon. Instinctively, she stepped forward to pick it up, bowing slightly as she handed it back to him. The young man blinked in surprise and gave her a quick smile. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. That word again, ma'am. Each time she heard it, it softened something inside her that she didn't know could still be softened. It wasn't the word itself that mattered, but what it carried. A kind of acknowledgement, as though her worth had not been erased by surrender. In the afternoons, Eiko and several others worked in the infirmary. It was a clean, sunlit building made of wood and canvas, smelling faintly of soap, iodine, and freshly laundered bandages. The American nurses were brisk but kind, often humming to themselves as they worked. They called Eiko by her name, pronounced imperfectly but with effort. "Eiko," they would say, smiling each time they got it right. She learned to respond with soft English words of gratitude, each one stitched together carefully like a wound being closed. "Thank you, good day, I help." The nurses never laughed at her attempts. Instead, they encouraged her gently, repeating phrases until she understood. One day, while cleaning a table of instruments, Eiko overheard two nurses talking. Their voices were low, almost tender. "I can't imagine what they've seen," one said. "They must miss home so much." "They're just like us," the other replied. "Same hands, same hearts. War just put them on the other side of the fence." The words hit Eiko like a slow wave. She had never thought an American would say something like that. Just like us. For so long, propaganda had painted the enemy as inhuman, monstrous. And perhaps on both sides, those lies had been easier to believe than the truth. But here, in this small camp under the quiet sky, truth had a different shape. One that looked like two women working side by side, one in uniform, the other in captivity, bound not by war, but by care. As the weeks passed, something else began to happen. The women started writing again. At first it was small, names, fragments of poems, quiet reflections scrawled on scraps of paper. They wrote not about the war, but about the moments that made them feel alive, a shared smile, a breeze through the window, the warmth of sunlight on a bowl of soup. Eiko wrote letters that would never be sent. She wrote to her mother, her sister, her younger brother who had gone to fight and never returned. "I thought captivity would break us," she wrote one evening. But here, among the people we were taught to hate, I have found kindness that I do not understand. It feels strange, like walking through a dream that is too gentle to be real. I no longer know what victory means, but I know what peace feels like. She tucked the letter into a small wooden box beside her bed. Every woman in her barracks had a similar box, not given by the Americans, but carved quietly by one of the prisoners from leftover scrap wood. It was their secret way of remembering who they were before the war had stolen their names. Sometimes, after their work was done, the women would gather near the edge of the camp's small garden, a patch of earth the Americans had allowed them to tend. Hannah smiled faintly. Then we must remember it for them. Outside, the night deepened. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly. Guards making their rounds, ensuring everything was as it should be. But even their presence no longer filled the women with fear. It was strange how quickly routine could reshape emotion. What had once been terrifying now felt almost protective, a structure that gave shape to their days. Over time, the gestures of kindness became more frequent. When one of the women fell ill, American medics visited their barracks and brought medicine without hesitation. When rain flooded the path between buildings, soldiers laid wooden planks to make walking easier. When one woman lost her small carved box, a guard helped her search until it was found. These were small things, barely noticeable against the backdrop of war, but they carried enormous meaning. Each act, no matter how simple, was a quiet declaration, "You are not forgotten." Aiko often wondered what the Americans thought of them. These women from the other side of the ocean, who spoke in low voices and bowed when they passed. Perhaps the soldiers were curious, perhaps they pitied them, or perhaps they simply saw reflections of their own sisters, wives and mothers. Whatever the reason, their behavior seemed guided by something deeper than policy, a sense of shared decency that no uniform could erase. One evening, as the women prepared for bed, the sound of rain began to fall softly on the roof. The camp grew hushed, the steady rhythm of raindrops mixing with the occasional crackle of thunder. Aiko lay awake, listening. She thought about everything that had changed since the day she first stepped into this camp. The fear, the confusion, the disbelief. And she realized that, somewhere along the way, her captors had taught her something her own leaders never could, that respect could exist without superiority, and compassion could coexist with strength. She turned her face toward the window, watching the faint reflection of lightning on the barbed wire. It no longer looked like a barrier. It looked like a reminder that even the hardest lines could catch the light if the right heart looked closely enough. Months later, when word came that the war had ended, the camp erupted with emotion. Some of the women wept openly, tears of relief, confusion, and fear of what came next. Would they be sent home? Would they be judged for surviving captivity? No one knew. That night, the Americans held a small gathering. There were no speeches, no flags, just a quiet meal shared under lantern light. This time, no one insisted who should eat first. They all sat together, Americans and Japanese, eating in silence, listening to the soft hum of insects and the whisper of wind through the trees. When the meal ended, Aiko stood and bowed deeply to the sergeant who had once told her, "Ladies first." She could not find the words in English to express what she felt, so she spoke in her own language. "Arigato gozaimashita," she said. "Thank you very much." He didn't understand the words, but he understood the emotion. He nodded once, quietly, and returned the gesture with his own small bow. As Aiko turned to leave, she glanced once more at the camp, the rows of tents, the lights fading into the distance, the wire fences that had once symbolized her imprisonment. Now, they seemed less like barriers and more like memories of a time when kindness had bloomed in the unlikeliest of places. When she finally walked beyond those fences months later, she didn't look back in anger. She looked back in understanding. For even though the war had taken nearly everything, it had given her something no victory could ever bring: the realization that humanity, when shown through small acts of grace, could outlast even the longest conflict. She would carry that truth for the rest of her life. In her letters, in her stories, in the quiet way she bowed to strangers as if to remind herself that respect, once given, is never truly lost. And as she stepped into the open air of freedom, the morning sun broke through the clouds, warming her face. She closed her eyes, smiled softly, and whispered to herself, "Kindness, that is the greatest honor."